great pleasure to introduce Michele Robert. You can read all about her in the programme. She's published 12 novels, one of which was shortlisted for the Booker. She's written short stories. She also writes poetry. I think that aspect of her work is perhaps less well known than it deserves to be. She was many years, well, for some years, a professor of creative writing at UEA 5. She's now an emeritus. And there are two sort of more personal things I want to say about Michele. That for years, she and I and Faye Weldon used to judge this wonderful prize, the Mind Book of the Year. A book of, it could go to a novel, book of poems, self-help manual, which in some way was addressed to the mind or mental distress. And we were exposed to extraordinary range of books outside our little literary rut that we sometimes run in. And it's rather like coming to this conference today, in fact, and being exposed to lots of stuff that you haven't necessarily thought about. And sadly, they've let this prize go, haven't they? And we've not had a chance to do it this last year. Another more speculative thought of mine is whether the fact that Michele, who is half English, half French, whether it isn't the French side of her that makes her so good when she's writing about food and sex. Surely it can't be the Englishness in her that accounts for that. But there's a great pleasure and sensuality in Michele's writing, always has been, which makes her the perfect person to finish off or bring us towards the end of today. So she actually is not just going to do readings. She's got a little talk on the erotic imagination, and there will be time. She's delighted to take questions afterwards. Michele.
Thanks to all of you for inviting me here today. I can't tell you what an honour it is to be invited to join with you today. And a great delight, because I got here before lunch, so I've been learning a great deal. My mind has been opening. All my orifices have been opening. The nuns at my convent school wouldn't have approved of us spending our Saturdays talking about sex. They were very worried about girls lying on beds reading books, what might happen. And I didn't know what that was for some years, but then I discovered it probably meant coming in bliss and rapture as you read Jane Eyre for the first time. And the feminist, and I have to call her pro-multicultural philosopher Julia Kristeva, talks about the rapture of reading, la jouissance. And in French, you know, it's an orgasm, it's pleasure. And that was cropping up in the session on pornography, I felt, where we watched a wonderful film of a woman being stimulated while she read aloud from a book, and then she collapsed into giggles as she came. But of course, when you're reading a wonderful book, you don't have to be stimulated by a magic wand under the desk. You just come with rapture. So that's worth remembering, isn't it? Why would anyone want to write about sex? For me, I think it's because sex isn't just a recreational activity, although obviously it can be that. It's about passion, it's about creativity, it's the source of creativity, I probably want to argue. It's about joy, it's about the life force in many ways. It's about struggle and rage and alienation, lots of things, but somehow it seems to be at the core of human life. But it's difficult to write about, and I know that I'm addressing a lot of writers here, so I'll tell you how to suck eggs, basically. Isn't it difficult to write about sex? Partly because the word can mean so much, so many different things. If you took the word orgasm, for example, it doesn't only mean what happens when a man and a woman do certain things together, or a woman on her own does certain things. We've got quite a narrow sense of it. Orgasm, if you read older stories and older texts, can mean the human experience to looking at a sunset, you know, or, as I've said before, to reading. And you can feel it at various points in your body. So the idea of the chakras, you can have an orgasm at each chakra. And when you're really getting off on listening to wonderful talks at conferences like this one, you have an orgasm here, which is the chakra of communication. So I hope you've all been orgasming away all day. I certainly have. So let's just think again about my dear Julia Kristeva. She reminds us that we use abstract words to signify other words which we might call desire, frustration, emotion itself. And she says this very beautiful thing. Those currents of bodily feeling we call emotion. So if sex is a current of bodily feeling, how do we write it? Not write about it, but write it. I think when I write it, I want to conjure it. And I just made a list. You've probably got loads more to add. Different ways, or different discourses, if you like, of writing about sex. There's the vague and romantic one, which is probably due to repression. You can write very powerfully via metaphor, as Jenny Lewis just reminded us. Emily Dickinson, for example, not known for her actual torrid sex life, but a poetry full of sexuality via metaphor, and I'd argue the same about someone like Christina Rossetti. You can write pornographically, which tends to mean not invoking memory in your characters or feeling. Certainly I connect pornographic writing about sex with objectification, which is just so much part of modern life. It's hard to think of other ways of writing about sex sometimes. And that seems to connect with the way that, I think it's Guy Debord says something about the way that everything that's been experienced has now been transformed into spectacle, so that we're used to being observers and watchers. Someone replied to that, what about stomachache? So that's up for debate. You can write clinically. The bad books, I think, often describe sex scenes through lists of body parts. And it's a kind of chopping up of a body in a morgue that's going on, I think. You get down to a certain part that's called a vagina sometimes. And of course that's Latin for sword sheath. So it's not really quite satisfactory anymore, I think. The word cunt, I really want to reclaim. I'm sure you've all talked about this already, but it's still quite problematic for how we name ourselves. I get really angry when people use cunt as an insult to each other, particularly when men do, I think, because it's our word. If they want to insult each other, they can be dicks or pricks, whatever they want, but they're not going to be cunts. So that's my one-woman fight on the streets of southeast London. You can just write about sex terribly coolly. I think that's very popular amongst a lot of my young writing students. You can write journalistically. And finally, you can write on the principle of less is more. And here I just want to invoke Radcliffe Hall, who wrote one of the most famous, infamous first novels about lesbianism in the modern period. And the climax for her two heroines is expressed thus: and that night they were not divided. Full stop. So what kind of writing about sex do I like? I thought I'd tell you very quickly. But how do I know that I like it? Well, going on the example of Marina Tsvetaeva, the great Russian poet, she said she recognised when a poem was wonderful because it made the hairs up and down her neck prickle, and she had shivers and currents running up her back. So it's a physical response. So for me, I know that I like writing that I then decide is sexy because it makes me feel incredibly sexy, and I just want to rush off and have sex with somebody. This is problematic when I'm on my own. I have to do that thing the nuns were frightened of my doing, especially because I love reading in bed. So I just mentioned some of the writers I like who've made me feel that kind of sexy recently. Ali Smith, chapter 1 of Hotel World, a body and soul of a dead woman get reunited in a grave. It sounds totally macabre, but it is a kind of lesbian scene. It's quite wonderful. That did it for me. Apollinaire, in Les Onze Mille Verges. He wrote it as absolute, straightforward, turn-em-on porn. And there's a brothel scene in it, which is, for me, so comic and excessive. It features casts of thousands all going at it at the same time. And it's that excess I love. There's a brothel scene in Fanny Hill. Whatever you think, what's going on in that novel. The brothel scenes are extraordinary. So clearly there's an appeal to some wish to be a female exhibitionist in me that I'm allowing to come out in fantasy when I read those novels. E.M. Forster's The Obelisk features a very straight Edwardian married couple, man and woman, going up a hill on their holiday, and they get separately seduced by a pair of gay sailors, and that's in a way the climax of the story when you realise what the obelisk might stand for. It's brilliantly comic, and again I think I'm recognising in myself a love of the comic when reading about sex. And then lastly I'll just mention Colette, one of my heroines, who takes sexuality back to the mother very often. And she writes very beautifully about how her mother used to come and snatch her out of her bed in the middle of the night if there was a thunderstorm coming. And she'd whirl her up the stairs and plunge her into her own huge bed and wrap her round. It's incredibly sensual and erotic, this embrace of the maternal body. And a lot of Colette's descriptions of sex in later novels, other novels, I think return to that rapture, but invite us to feel it as well. So, my erotic imagination obviously responds to writing that unsettles me somehow. I don't like a lot of the porn I've seen or looked at because it seems so cliched. I like to be put on the back foot, on the wrong foot. I like to be turned upside down and shaken. And I like work that works by suggestion very often. Of course, that leaves plenty of room for the reader's imagination. And I like comic excess. So I'll just say something about being a young woman, because I was incredibly moved and disturbed to realise that in a way things have come back round again almost to the 1950s. Young women are still being made to feel a need to please, which is excessive perhaps. The feminist movement in the 70s was partly a revolution in culture as well as in politics. And a lot of writing was sort of released, carnivalesque, wild, poetic, angry writing. And we were trying to get at what we very probably naively thought was some kind of truth about women's unspoken desires, sexual experience, longings, wishes, anger. Some of us were very influenced by the situationists, by the surrealists, and were beginning to think about different kinds of literary form and moving away from realism, which didn't seem adequate. But I just want to say, la lutte continue, the struggle goes on. It seems to be being reborn again at the moment. And I think for my generation, it was very important for us when we encountered psychoanalysis, care of Juliet Mitchell's great book, Feminism and Psychoanalysis, because it gave us a model for thinking about power differences between women and how painful even the closest friendships between women could be, as indeed between women lovers. And if we were only writing an erotic literature that was about fulfilled desire and wonderful women being so sweet to each other, it perhaps wasn't quite adequate. There was a wonderful American dyke called Pat Califia, who was very into SM, and she would rant and rave about all these pathetic heterosexual women in the women's movement whose idea of sex, if they became lesbian, was to take their shirts off, stand in a circle and hold hands. And she originated the term vanilla sex, which we now use so widely. But using the model of mother-daughter tensions and conflicts via Freud and Winnicott and other people, I felt able to start exploring difficult relationships between women that might contain aspects of eroticism. So I've written quite a lot about sadomasochism, which really interests me, because I don't see it just as acted out between men and women. I see it as going back to relationships in the family, and therefore it can involve two women. And I remember being very inspired by the frescoes of the Red Room at Pompeii, where one woman is bent over the knees of another who is a priestess. She's stripped to the waist, and there's a witness rank of women, and she's being whipped by the priestess. It's some kind of ritual which the writer Noor Hall, a Jungian, has speculated about. Again, in my novel Flesh and Blood, sorry, that's another Flesh and Blood is made up of stories, so that's one story. I've also got a heretical convent where an abbess administers the sacrament of penance to her daughters in ways she deems fit. And in the same novel, I was inspired, thank you, dear Freud, to write a story about the Marquis de Sade's home life. And I think that novel really shows my willingness and need to experiment with form, in that it's a book that's broken in half, because it dramatises a struggle between a mother and daughter, which is almost to the death. So at the beginning it's broken, and to read it you've got to follow the track of the narrative, back. You get to a hinge where things might turn round, they do, and you read back towards the beginning. So as you read back towards the beginning, you're closing the novel back up together. You're mending a wound, you're stitching up a wound. And I was proud of that invention, which came out quite a long time ago, because it's influenced other writers, and I'm proud of that. But I think that's one of the things about the erotic imagination in writing, is that perhaps we need new forms. We put new wine into new flasks. I'll tell you a joke now about, in that same novel, I was really going about sex. It's a novel completely about sex. I wrote a description of an orgasm from a woman's point of view. So it's female subjectivity, orgasm experience from inside, using metaphor. And I read it again this morning just to check, lying in bed. And I thought, this is quite tasteful. This is not extremely excessive. But of course I got shortlisted for the Bad Sex Award, which is run by a lot of public school people who are very scared of sex, I think, particularly of women. And it's funny, it did have a censoring effect. Every time now I write a sex scene, I think, the big brothers and sisters of the Bad Sex Award are watching. So we have to resist. We have to keep writing about sex. I want to tell you about another passage in that book, because one of the topics that came up in the session on pornography I went to before lunch was looking at ads for websites, and the ads, the straplines, whatever, seem to be promising the male voyeur, nothing but loads of luscious women giving blowjobs. Okay, and the actual content of the sites, of course, is much, much more varied. 20 years ago, I remember reading a little piece in The Guardian on the women's page where a woman was arguing that oral sex, woman to man, was automatically demeaning for a woman. He was oppressing her. And I was just outraged by this. I thought, what about women's desire, women's subjectivity? Who are you to tell me I'm being demeaned by something I want to do? So I wrote a sort of comic erotic scene in Flesh and Blood where the man is so blissed out, he's shouting to the woman, "Where did you learn to do this? You're fantastic at it." And she says, "At my mother's breast, of course, where else?" So the maternal body, she's always floating around in my sex scenes somewhere. And I've also wanted to write, part of my subject matter is about incest, fantasies of incest, the love of father and daughter that can involve incestuous fantasy. And again, that's my act of resistance about this word paedophilia, kind of wrapping everything up, and then you put it away and you say, well, that's disgusting, and a discussion. I want to write about children's sexuality and children's longings. There's a lot to be written, I think, about little girls and how they feel. More recently, I've discovered I like writing sexual comedy. So I've written a story about Stéphane Mallarmé, the poet, who has writer's block. But he discovers if he puts on female costume, he invents a new kind of poetry, and modernism dawns in France. And that's a joke about écriture féminine, because Christopher argued that men can do it too, like James Joyce. Men are brilliant at écriture féminine, just to remind you. So I've done piss takes of porn and romance, which are usually separated categories in our culture, and I've put them back together, cut them back together, and made, I hope they're funny stories. I wrote a whole novel as a homage to Chicklet called Reader, I Married Him. It features a psychopath, I'm sorry to say, but perhaps I should call it Hagrid. I think, yeah, writing about a woman in her 50s with an active sex life and masses of desire. Now I think there are all these horrible journalistic terms like cougars and so on. But that novel was written 10 years ago when there weren't quite these insults flying around. They were just sort of silent. But I still think it's a taboo for today's culture for novelists to try and dramatise the sexual longings and experiences of older women. So, because I feel it's a taboo, and I'm living in a culture where you're told you're very ugly once you're past 40 and you're not desirable and so on and so on and so on. The minute I see a taboo, of course, I want to rush at it and embrace it and dance the tango with it and have a good time with it. And I just want to, before I do a little reading, I just want to mention a really strong current taboo I feel I meet when I'm teaching and of course reading is the taboo about emotion. It seems quite difficult for lots of people at the moment to write about sex in a way that somehow lets emotion be part of the writing. And there seems to be a kind of fear about emotion. And I wonder whether that's just partly because of the way that romance, obviously has a very bad name. It's pathetic, it's rubbish, it's what silly women read, and it's where you encounter emotion. Therefore, of course, it interests me precisely because it's a slagged off genre. So it's as though emotion gets then separated from writing about sex. So there's something kind of sloppy and feminine and uncool about putting emotion into a sex scene. Recently I read Paul Bailey's latest novel, The Prince's Boy, and it's about two gay men in Paris in the early 20th century. And the sex scenes are absolutely extraordinary because they're very tender and very loving. They're sort of explicit, but when I say they're sort of explicit, they're not clinical, they're not objectifying. They're about masculine subjectivity in the act of love, and full of this tenderness and wit. So it obviously can be done. So because I'm so interested in why there is this taboo about emotion, I thought, well, the next thing to do is to write from a male point of view to explore that. So my current novel that I'm writing is about the sex trade in the 19th century, and it's written completely from a male point of view. Because I thought there's an awful lot of hand-wringing that goes on, it's very well meant, about the sex trade in various places. Great, but I thought I don't want to do that. I want to write about desire. So, and it's fun to do a reverse Mallarmé. I do feel like to put drag on when I write as a man, which is lovely. All right, now, sticking to time, I'm going to read you just a page, I think. Blake mentioned that one of my favourite subjects that overlaps with sex is food, and you can see that if I write about oral sex, I've immediately got to put sucking at the breast in, and I immediately have this maternal body who keeps floating in. And of course the maternal body is the body that nourishes us. And I think the rapture at the breast is the first experience of rapture that we then repeat in different ways all through our lives in other parts. So this is just a story about a woman who's very, very keen on food and also passionately in love. And she's seen a celebrity chef on TV demonstrating his cookery, and she's discovered that he runs cookery classes in his home in Holland Park. So she attends one, and the class ends, and that's that. But of course she's still very much in love with him. So the story is really an embodiment of her musing upon him and musing upon all the wonderful recipes that he's taught her and that she practices in her lonely bedsit night after night. She now starts to need to be near him again, so she starts to go back to Holland Park quite regularly and stand outside his house. If you'd looked down into the street first thing yesterday, darling, when you got up, as you should have done, you'd have seen me there again, patiently attending on your pleasure, holding the bunch of mixed pink and red carnations and roses I bought for you in the 24-hour supermarket next to the tube. But without warning me first, you changed your signal. You changed your routine. You didn't draw the curtains, open the window and lean out to sniff the frosty autumnal air as you've done all week. You didn't look out and spot me as you usually do. I spied the lights go on behind the grey curtains, damask, I think, gleaming and heavy, but you weren't to be seen. In the end, I was forced to leave the flowers on your front step. I hadn't got all day, my darling. I couldn't hang about waiting for you on the off chance indefinitely. I knew you'd realise immediately the flowers were from me. Oh, with what cunning I invent new ways to mention your name. At least once a day I gently insert you into my conversations with bus conductors, dry cleaners, my fellow clerks at work, and now the waitresses and greasy spoons. I thread you in like lardons into chicken skin before roasting. I rock you with my words, my darling. I hold you in the hands of my language, and I caress you with my tongue all over. At the same time, no one must suspect it's my secret, ours. You're my secret, my prisoner. I keep you captive inside my mouth and belly. I swallow you down with bites of mushroom and fried egg. You're mine, you're mine, you're mine. So, my darling, good night. Until tomorrow, then. I'll see you even earlier than usual, long before you're expecting me. I'll tiptoe into your house by the cellar door under the front steps, which you carelessly left unlocked yesterday, and whose key I was able to purloin, have copied and replace all in the space of 20 minutes. I don't like stealing and deceit, sweetheart, but you left me with no choice. You stopped communicating with me, and thus threatened to deprive me of all I hold most dear, your love, my reason for living. I can't stand rejection, being dropped into the bottomless black pit, where there is only the starving monster tearing with its fangs at its human prey, where there is only mouth and teeth and biting and death. You must not send me there, darling. I shouldn't be able to survive, not after I had known this love. So I'll creep into your bedroom while you're still asleep. I'll sit and watch you sleeping for a while. Then out of my handbag, I'll take my Sabatier knife, the one you recommended, that I use for carving. You won't need to be afraid. You won't feel a thing, I promise you. I'm your apt pupil. I shall be accurate. I shall be swift. I'll hold you in my arms and kiss your beautiful hands, and then I'll cut you up and cook you and eat you, and we'll never be parted again. Oh no, never more, my sweet angel. You'll be mine forever, and you won't be able to leave me, darling flesh of my flesh. Not this time. Oh no, never again.